Hello, everyone, and welcome to the sixth installment of the speaker series, The Liberal Imaginary and Beyond, which is co-sponsored by the Religions and Public Life program at the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, and the Center on Modernity and Transition. I'm Benjamin Schewel, a senior fellow at the Kenan Institute and director of the Center on Modernity and Transition, and I'll be one of your hosts for the speaker series.
It was bound to happen sometime. I'm Shahrzad Sabet. I'm a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, and I'm also your host for this series.
So the aim of this series is to examine the origins, contents, and development of liberalism after the Second World War, as well as to consider significant attempts to move beyond the resultant social imaginary without casting aside its impressive achievements. So we are thrilled to have with us today Arie Dubnov and Andrius Galisanka, who will be discussing the topic Giants of Post-War Liberalism, Isaiah Berlin and John Rawls. So one fun fact to mention is that last month, February, would have been Rawls' 100th birthday, as well as the 50th anniversary of the publication of A Theory of Justice. So it would seem to be an auspicious time to engage our chosen theme. I also cannot imagine having two more qualified and interesting scholars to speak with us about this topic today. So Arie Dubnov is the Max Ticktin Chair of Israeli Studies at George Washington University and author of Isaiah Berlin, The Journey of a Jewish Intellectual. Andrius Galisanka is Assistant Professor of Politics at Wake Forest University and author of John Rawls, The Path to a Theory of Justice. Arie, Andrius, welcome.
Be here.
Thank you for bringing us together.
So we like to begin each talk on a biographical note. I'd like to start then by asking each of you to tell us a bit about the experiences and personal histories, the questions and the curiosities that led you to think and write not only about intellectual history, but also specifically about the figures of Isaiah Berlin and John Rawls. Andrius, perhaps we could start with you.
My first thoughtful engagement with Rawls took place in graduate school. I was interested in questions of justification, how we can defend a political vision or moral vision, to some extent an ethical vision as well. And Rawls seemed to offer a very convincing answer to those questions at that time. So in A Theory of Justice, he introduces a concept he calls reflective equilibrium, which is the invitation to start out with your intuitive judgments and then try to explicate them in terms of broader reasons that lie behind them. That seemed a very appealing picture to me on very many different grounds. On a human level, it told us that we as humans are very quick to say, this is just or this is unjust. But when we're asked to explain why that's the case, sometimes we don't quite know, at least right away, why we make those judgments. And so Rawls viewed political and moral philosophy as an attempt to explain the broader concepts that lie behind those intuitions. He also offered a holistic vision. At that time, I was very much influenced by meaning holism of Wittgenstein, Quine, Mark Beaver, with the idea that if you hold some view, that view is bound to affect at least some other related concepts. And so Rawls's position that if we defend a political vision such as liberalism, we have to set it against other political visions such as utilitarianism. That seemed very appealing to me. So that's why I got interested in Rawls on my own terms, and that's why I started exploring his work historically. Once I did so, then new reasons for being drawn, I suppose, to Rawls's way of thinking emerged. So, as you discussed in your earlier seminars as well, there are so many influences on liberalism and Rawls's thought. So before the Second World War, he engages in with liberal Protestantism. After the war, with various branches of analytic philosophy, from Carnap to Wittgenstein to Quine. Those thinkers were interesting in their own rights, but it was also interesting to see how Rawls responded to those thoughts, how much he engaged with them. You can obviously see some of it in the footnotes in A Theory of Justice, for example, but they don't reveal the extent to which Rawls actually took those background ideas seriously. He even indexed Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, for example, spending incredible amounts of time on them. So it was interesting to see how Rawls drew on the many lines of thought to come to a book that we all know. And I guess for the talk series, it's interesting to to see how many different philosophical traditions liberalism draws on during that entire time period. So that was interesting as well.
So Ari, we turn to you now.
Well, first and foremost, this is fascinating, and thank you for engaging, bringing us to and asking us to have this dialogue. It's extremely important at our time and age, the age of the pandemic, and in a way, this is perhaps the best homage to Berlin when he was knighted by the Queen. Famously, someone said he was knighted for his abilities as a conversationalist. I don't think I'll be as good as Berlin was in engaging in conversations, but I think that this is not. In Berlin's case, it's also the medium is the message, and we will talk about his philosophy and thought. I was drawn to Berlin from a very early stage as a student, and it had to do with, if you'd like, an early intellectual schizophrenia I was suffering from, or bipolar disorder. It took me a long time to understand whether I wanted to pursue a degree in philosophy or in history. And something that was strikingly, that I found fascinating about Berlin, that he's appearing on both sides, on both camps. There's Berlin, who is producing these seminal texts that any class, especially Introduction to Political Theory, will return to, and these canonical lectures, especially on the concept of liberty. And I felt, wow, but there's also a historical context there that is needs to be explored. How is it connected to Cold War politics? How is it connected to the time and place he's producing it? And there's Berlin, who is this wonderful essayist that is producing these marvelous essays on historical figures, on Montesquieu and Herder, on Herzen and the Russian intellectuals that the philosophers are not reading, at least at the time. Now it's more complicated. And I think that this passion, the fact that I was in a way muddled, my mind was muddled and confused, drew me to someone that always I thought is a brilliant mind, but exactly part of what makes his ideas so fascinating is that he doesn't have a one big system that is problem-free. And in a way, I was drawn also due to the fact this is not Immanuel Kant. This is not Hegel. It's you automatically see the tensions, you see the inconsistencies, and these cracks are fascinating. So in a way, it helped me understand that what I want to do is to be a historian that is not solving the problems and creating a system and imposing it on a thinker that lacks it, but actually a historian that wants to understand what are the problems, the dilemmas, and the circumstances that produced such a rich body of thought.
That's very interesting. And thank you both for sharing a little bit about your own personal and intellectual biographies before we delve even more deeply into those of Berlin and Rawls. Isaiah Berlin and John Rawls obviously are towering figures of post-war liberalism, and their work continues to exert a powerful outsized influence on the post-war liberal imaginary that we've been focusing on in this series. So I want to start the conversation today with a three-pronged question that begins to probe your thinking on the contents and origins of this influence. First, what is the most distinctive contribution of these thinkers from your perspective? Second, what do you see as their most underrated or underappreciated contribution to post-war political thought? And finally, as intellectual biographers of Berlin and Rawls respectively, could you also tell us a little bit more about the relevant personal and intellectual context in and through which these contributions were shaped? Ari, perhaps you could begin by addressing these questions with respect to Berlin.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's a wonderful question. I will actually try to answer it from the end. I'll fall back on my the world of the biographer, and maybe perhaps some of the biographical details can then help exploring and unpacking these tensions. Isaiah Berlin was, of course, an emigre. He was born in Riga, today Latvia. At the time, was not yet Latvia. And through serendipitous path. The family ended up in London, and one needs to also mention that on the one hand, it's a Jewish family that was very rooted in the Jewish community at this time, but at the same time, it's an upper class, very wealthy family. His father was a timber merchant. His business ties were very instrumental in helping the immigration. And I mention these facts because Berlin then is, on the one hand, is a classic story of an European exile that makes new home in England. But unlike many other emigres that sometimes became more English than the English, there were elements both in his identity, but later I would argue also in his thought, that resisted, this strong urge that is not unique to Jews. It's an emigre disposition of assimilating and hiding your background and trying to, become, almost just camouflage yourself into the new environment, even on small things like insisting on keeping his Jewish name Isaiah. There's a famous story that ran through the family that already at St. Paul's and at school, his tutor said, "You're a brilliant young man. Why won't you change your name to something like Jim?" Right, and I suggested in my book that in a way, part of his decision to keep the Isaiah identity in him is sort of no, I am not here to pretend that I'm not who I am. And part of his success in the British, academia had to do with the new generation that was willing to accept this difference and even saw in him this stranger coming from Eastern Europe, that they were already, these are great minds. I'm thinking about the people who rubbed shoulders with Stuart Hampshire, A.J. Ayer, many famous intellectuals and poets, but they were in a way understood that there is something about the British intellectual elite that paradoxically is also very parochial. And he was for them this, person coming from Eastern Europe. They simply dubbed it Russia, and someone that can speak, so freely and jump between Tolstoy and Herzen and then connect it to Wittgenstein and jump from there to talk about Rossini and opera and music. And that was something that was very fresh. So I mention it because I think that part of what you see in Berlin's biography is his career, in a way, is a very interesting development that is not disconnected from his path as emigre intellectual. On the one hand, one can say that his first early years, in which he's steeped in Oxford analytical philosophy, and also plays a role alongside people like J.L. Austin in producing what we know today, call today Oxford's philosophy, that puts so much emphasis on the importance of having our terms exact, correct definitions, and also demarcating what we can talk about and what is, in a way, not part of the realm of philosophy. So metaphysics is out of the question. Theology is out of the question. So Berlin famously said about himself that he's not, he's simply tone deaf to theology. I think it's a bit of an exaggeration, but that was his sort of presentation. But later on, after the war, and the war played an important role in forming his career, he not only becomes a political thinker and then produces the seminal inaugural lecture, the chiefly professor at Oxford, known today as Two Concepts of Liberty, but also moves slowly beyond political theory to basically calling himself a historian of ideas. As a historian of ideas, the type of writing that history allowed him, the footnote-free essayistic style, the ability to just dive in and sort of live the life of a different intellectual for for a while, for the few weeks or few months that you were trying to study Herzen or Bakunin or Rousseau or Machiavelli, allowed him to do things that the very formal Oxford philosophy did not allow him. It was not part of it was not allowed in terms of the rules of the game, the rules of engagement in philosophy at the time. So in a way, that's a very long and convoluted way to answer the first question. So in a way, probably and rightly so, still the two most important philosophical contributions, so to speak, are on the one hand the famous dichotomy or division between a positive conception of liberty and a negative conception of liberty, and which I'm sure we'll return to. But the second idea, namely pluralism, or to be more precise, value pluralism, is the second most important contribution. And I would argue that he wouldn't have had the second, element of his thought without transitioning into history of ideas. History of ideas was the place for him to examine what exactly bothered him about these big Enlightenment systems that assume this harmonious universe, and this is where value pluralism started to be developed. And many interpreters would argue that it's a brilliant insight that remained underdeveloped. To the very last days of his life, students, commentators, colleagues will ask him, Shahrzad, tell us more. What do you mean by value pluralism? And in a good sense, it's half-baked, but I'm sure we'll return to that.
Andrius, a similar question to you. What do you see as John Rawls's most distinctive and least appreciated contributions to political thought? And how did his own personal and intellectual history shape these contributions?
It is an excellent question, and it's particularly interesting in the context of Rawls, I think, because he was so good at coining technical terms as influential popular phrases, so public reason, original position, even terms such as reasonable pluralism, which play a role in his overall argument, nonetheless are captivating enough to become part of a popular culture. But I'll come back to those, but I wanted to start with the most underappreciated contribution, which is not maybe very interesting on its own, but I think historically for liberalism, it's a very important one, which is that he simply put together the conceptual framework to defend his own theory of justice as fairness. To say he had concepts that he thought were crucial to that theory, liberty, equality, the common good. He did something to show at least how roughly they would extend to an institutional framework, and then also offered thoughts about justification of that theory. And I say it's important because, to come back to my earlier comment about the relative justification, to present a contrast or a rival, so to say, to the dominant utilitarianism of the time, you first of all had to have that rival to construct that theory. And in his lectures to his students, Rawls would often say, before we talk about justification, we have to have a theory to justify. And that's what he did in a lot of lectures in the 1960s, to just painstakingly draw on various historical thinkers to say, maybe we should understand liberty in this way or in some other way. And so I think to explain why the theory of justice was so influential, it's important to acknowledge that it was that what's so-called Green Bible. There were all the things, exaggerating, but still all the things in it. But when it comes to the most distinctive contributions there, I do want to say something about public reason, but I'll leave it maybe to later questions as well, which is a guide for citizens by which we should decide various public questions. It's a guide that's also publicly shared. So it's a requirement that as we think about what kind of laws should govern our society, we should reason with other citizens in terms that they can understand. So we should express ourselves in those public reasons. And that's definitely a very important term. But I wanted to emphasize something less flashy, I guess, if that term can be used in Rawls's context, and namely the concept of basic structure, which I think was and still is a very important concept. It's not something that Rawls invented. Political philosophy had long considered social justice questions, but Rawls put an emphasis onto what he called arrangement of various social, political, economic, and cultural institutions. So the rules, economic rules such as laws of property, our political rights, cultural exchanges, the family structure, and so on. And I think what was so influential about this concept is to explain why it matters so much. And as he put it, it determines in part the way that people growing up in those initial circumstances will think of themselves and the kind of chances they'll have later on in life. Even not even today, in debates about international justice, for example, animal justice, this concept of basic structure and the influence it has on the creatures which are to be found in it is still very important. And as to the intellectual influences, there are many examples to be picked. Wittgenstein comes to mind when it comes to the concept of practices, for example, to explain why it is that we should talk about society's institutions or the more informal practices that govern our behaviors. And here, analogy of the games was important for Rawls. It did not start with Wittgenstein, at least not in a significant way. Rawls drew on Frank Knight, the economist beforehand, on decision theory, on the game theory. There are various traditions which use that analogy to games. But when he started seriously considering philosophical investigations, there was, according to him anyhow, this idea that games have to be governed by some set of rules. If we have to play it, we have to understand at least some basic governing guidelines in those games. So that was the initial part. He was trying to describe the various social arrangements by which our society is governed. And also importantly, as Wittgenstein argued, that sometimes when we try to describe various rules or meanings of terms, we might not find anything shared. So the best that we can have is something like a family resemblance at best. And for Rawls, that was a shaping idea to say that that's right. We're looking at practices. And what we seek is not the kind of clarity that would provide definitions of each particular practice, each particular term, such as even liberty and equality, but and a sufficient overlap. I'll stop here. These concepts will come up later on, I think, when we talk about later contributions of these thinkers.
So, as you've both touched upon some of the core insights and convictions of Isaiah Berlin and John Rawls with relationship to liberalism, in not just the popular mind insofar as they figure in, but amongst academics as well. Their arguments tend to be often fairly neatly associated with the work, respectively, of two concepts of liberty and a theory of justice. But as you demonstrate in your own work, the reality of their intellectual development is far more complex, both before these works and afterward. So I was wondering if you could each say a few words about how the liberal visions of Rawls and Berlin evolved over the course of their respective careers. I'd also be quite interested to hear what you think we might be able to learn about the course of liberalism during the second half of the 20th century by examining the intellectual trajectories of these two towering figures. So Andrius, perhaps we can start with you.
I'll focus my comments on a problem of disagreement. I think it was the most important political problem for Rawls, and it also allows us to bring the two thinkers together, because Rawls considered Berlin's argument in all stages of his career, also as he moved away from the arguments of a theory of justice. But what I find striking about a theory of justice and the writings preceding it is that even though Rawls acknowledged the problem of disagreement from the very early on, from his writings in the 40s, it never seemed to him as an unresolvable problem. It was a task for philosophy and so for him to show that there is some underlying shared vision, which we already hold, or else we can be convinced to hold as a result of deliberations or philosophical arguments. And so, for example, he finished his edits of a theory of justice in the late 60s during the civil rights movement, student protests against universities, freedom of expression there, against the war in Vietnam. And one might think, I might think from a retrospect that this would seriously contest this underlying belief that we can all achieve a shared vision despite all of the activity going on. But I mean, Rawls had his own reasons. He had a way of explaining why we are misled to not see this shared vision. So, for example, he thought, following Wittgenstein, that we have natural feelings and that what misleads them is our being too closely tied to our own personal interest. And so his famous thought experiment of the original position was a way of trying to move us away from these attachments, our aspects of our identity, our sex, our race, our conceptions of the good, and so on. And so that was his explanation. And he also had the apparatus. That's what he did in a lot of the 60s and late 50s, to construct an apparatus by which he could actually show that there is a shared vision to which we can all arrive at. So that explains his confidence on his own grounds. But I think once we do historical study, there are some interesting things to see there. So to come back to Arie's points about value pluralism in Berlin, for example, already in the early 50s, Rawls dealt with this argument, as it was an influential argument in Oxford circles, and Rawls visited Oxford in 52 to 53. But he also considered those arguments slightly before that, and his solution to that was simply to say, well, we are going to provide principles of justice which can almost be seen as axioms, but they'll be loose enough. They'll contain what he calls bins of reason. So it might be a principle of justice about the extent of liberty, but what it will contain is various ways of understanding freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and so on. And then different persons, as they look at these principles and they use them in their lives, will draw on different aspects, different bins, so to say, or different reasons in those bins. And so they will emphasize one of these reasons as more weighty than another, for example. And so that's how I think he's able to think alongside with Berlin and incorporate some of Berlin's most distinctive contributions into his own thought. But I also think his background was slightly different than Berlin's, and that matters there too, that he drew on a scientific, he drew scientific analogies between a scientific way of thinking and an ethical thinking when he started his secular, so to say, career in ethical thinking. So he borrowed from the logical positivists, Popper's notion of basic statements, Carnap's protocol statements, to say that once we give judgments of justice, we can make them equivalent. We should view them as equivalent to those protocol statements. So there's this belief that even though we all start our beliefs from different conceptual frameworks, there are still some statements that are distant enough from those conceptual frameworks and can therefore be shared. And I think that's something that should be recognized more than it is that this initial training of Rawls and the analogies between ethics and science that he drew. So those are the early years. And in the later years, by which I mean political liberalism mainly, he acknowledges what he calls burdens of judgment. And to come back again to Arie's points, it's interesting how Berlinian these burdens of judgments are. So one of them says, for example, that human beings might hold the same values, but the weight of these values will be different for them, which I think is one of, like you said, Berlin's contributions. He also acknowledges Berlin's point that a society can only acknowledge a certain range of values and there'll always be a loss, which again, and he refers to Berlin in those. But so to come back to your point about what this tells about liberalism more broadly, I think it shows that in the post-war liberalism, this shared belief that we can come with to a shared viewpoint which can explain away our disagreements stems from a variety of sources, including Wittgensteinian way of thinking. But I also emphasize these analogies between ethics and science. And when you come to the later years, I think there Rawls' thinking reflects more the changing background, which he himself supported to some extent. And you see the importance of deliberative democracy theories, agonistic democracy, Kimlicka's writings on culture, for example, which Rawls tries to address in his own way of thinking. And then finally, a short note is, I think it's also interesting how Rawls responds to that challenge in the later years, and that he still draws on the same themes to say that there are comprehensive doctrines in which we talk about what's meaningful about human existence. But then there are also political views which are not necessarily dependent on those views about what's valuable in human life. So there's still that separation to be drawn, between conceptual, important parts of our conceptual frameworks, in this case, the political parts. And that's a fact about liberalism that I think Rawls, to some extent, created.
Thank you, Andrius. So, Ari, again, can you tell us about Berlin's development of his liberal thought throughout his career, and also how you think this development helps to illuminate certain broader trends in post-war liberal thought?
Yeah, that's a very important question, because it sort of in a way touches upon even a more fundamental question of why should we call a thinker like Berlin a liberal? I would defend his definition, the definition that reads him as a liberal, not necessarily because I would place him automatically in a sort of imagined tradition that's, as if it continues John Stuart Mill, Lord Acton, in this uninterrupted, very British tradition of liberalism. Of course, he's influenced by them, but I don't think that that's the best reading. I mean, conceptually, I think the two key elements here are, of course, his insistence on defining liberty. And I think we should go back to it and what he meant by this kind of the definition, the division between positive and negative conception of the liberty. And also because there is something very liberal in an underlying assumption that is a very Berlinian assumption, that at the end of the day, an individual is the basic building block of a political philosophy. So he definitely has very strong sentiments or elements that, to use the parlance of the 1990s, would be can be recognized as communitarian. Berlin, this is one of the most interesting tensions, and I think it's a productive tension that you can find in Berlin's thought. On the one hand, he is committed to a very liberal conception that at the end of the day, it's an individual who makes choices, and we need to, when we are thinking about who is the entity that needs to enjoy liberty, it's an individual. He even has these spatial metaphors about how to think about liberty as the space in which one can make choice. But on the other hand, he is the first one to acknowledge that part of what makes one human is the need of a community. There's a wonderful sentence I sometimes use in introducing Berlin that is taken actually not from a philosophical book, but from his wonderful collection of recollections that is called Personal Impressions, his meetings with various intellectuals and so on. And he writes them there at the epilogue very beautifully, that when a man complains of loneliness, they mean that nobody understands what they are saying. To be understood is to share common past, common feelings and language, common assumptions, and possibility of intimate communication. Now, I'm bringing this quote to our discussion, not only because it's kind of to bring the music and the tone of Berlin, but also because in a way one can suggest that look what's happening here. Here is a someone who started his career as a philosopher, that one thinks that understanding is about accurate, precise definition of liberty. But at the end of the day, to be understood is to be in the company of people who are like you, common past, common feeling, language, common assumptions, which is not disconnected from the historical context and his background. So I suggest reading Berlin also as someone that is trying to grapple all the time with the challenge of nationalism. So when we're talking about Berlin as a post-war liberal, and I think that this is an accurate description, it's a good label. We can, unpack post-war in several directions. Definitely, post-war is also Cold War. And it's undeniable. And Berlin, it's not only that Berlin spends so much of his energy writing about the Soviet Union and its totalitarian regime and to try to understand the origins of totalitarianism. But even more than that, in a way, part of what made the division between negative and positive liberty so influential and effective is the degree to which it provided a vocabulary that was so desperately needed in era in which you imagine an iron wall separating East and West, and so there's a very, very Cold War element there. I mean, it's not only because Berlin knew Winston Churchill personally and admired him that he's drawn to do that. Here's someone that is trying to not think about politics only in abstractum. He looks beyond the Iron Curtain at a different regime that describes itself as a democracy, that says that it produces, advances liberty. And he's not saying they're idiots, or he wants to understand how on earth they can imagine themselves as doing this. So there's an element in the division between between positive liberty, the understanding of liberty as mastery, understanding the liberty as even a rule of experts that will lead you towards the liberty that is very much colored by Cold War realities, and then hence the defense of redefining the proper post-war liberalism as leaning more towards a negative definition of liberty is very much colored by both those ideological rivalries and that historical context. And again, it's sometimes assumed, and not correctly, that as if that Berlin was the one that was the first person to offer that dichotomy. The dichotomy appeared in earlier works, and in a way, Berlin is interestingly eclectic here. There's definitely Thomas Hill Green, the great idealist philosopher that offered this definition. He's using these terms, positive liberty and negative liberty. Berlin owed much to the French, Swiss-French philosopher Benjamin Constant, that talked about the division between ancient liberty and modern liberty. And many things work their way into this division. But the seminal contribution, if you like, in Berlin is that emphasis. In a way, if you compare him to Thomas Hill Green, it's as if he turned him upside down, right? The negative is the one we need to defend and protect, and which is very much connected to that post-war era. But the tension I alluded to earlier, the sense of that part of what makes us human is the need of community, of company, of belonging, sort of a showing the limits of this individualism. No man is an island type of approach is also something that should be understood both due to his personal background as a Jew, as someone that supported Jewish nationalism very much, and so, but also the realities of post-war years that we've mentioned, Cold War, but it's also the era of decolonization, that you have nationalist movements that in a way are using a positive notion of liberty. They are launching campaigns they describe themselves as freedom fighters, and for Berlin, and one can argue there's something slightly conservative or that shies away from the ugly struggles and the dirty wars of decolonization. And we have to remember he's a British thinker that says, yes, there's something that is basically wrong about thinking that fighting for a sovereign nation state and kicking out the colonialist, which might be a good thing, but this is not about liberty. It's founded on a very positive notion of liberty. It's you want to be the master of your house, but don't call it liberty, right? In a way, one can use Berlinian language in that way. And this can explain also why many New Left thinkers were not exactly crazy about Berlin, and he was seen to them as a spokesman of the establishment and something that is an old guard. And lastly, I mean, I think that this is perhaps also where a very interesting tension, coupling Berlin and Rawls is fascinating in that respect, because so many overlaps and so many things that are similar. But I think that in a critical, one critical point where probably Berlin would have deeply disagreed with Rawls is connected to the Rawlsian thought experiment, the veil of ignorance, right? This that falls back on a classic sort of it's a much more sophisticated exercise of thinking about the state of nature that we see in so many social contract theories. There is something that Berlin fundamentally disagreed with this mode of thought, because there's an assumption that is built into that, is that we can imagine a situation in which we are these free-floating minds. We don't know. In order to have a veil of ignorance, we are stripped off all the things that make us human, right? We don't know our gender, our background, whether after, little will we know if after the veil of ignorance will be lifted, if we'll be rich or poor, and so on. So there's something about Berlin that rejects this abstraction as an Enlightenment type of device that I think he deeply disagreed with, and this is why he did not create these systems. And I think that this is where there's a very interesting tension between their liberalisms.
Well, I want to actually pose a question that picks up on what you've been saying, Ari, and then maybe after that, Andrius can also chime in and respond. The relationship between nationalism, cosmopolitanism, and liberalism is obviously heavily contested in post-war political philosophy. And while Berlin doesn't propose, as you say, a clear, explicit, and systematic resolution to these debates, he is deeply attentive, both personally and intellectually, to the dilemmas or the dualities that underpin them, as you've been saying. The duality, for example, between Enlightenment ideas of reason, individualism, and universal norms on the one hand, and particularist notions of belonging and collective identity that are associated with a counter-Enlightenment on the other. So it emerges from Berlin's attentiveness to both sides of this duality is a liberalism that, first of all, aligns itself with nationalism, or perhaps more accurately, with a benign form of national feeling, as Berlin calls it. It's also a liberalism that, as you write in your book, offers, and now I'm quoting, a very non-Rawlsian and unconventional liberal theory, which incorporates diversity and soft conceptions of identity, end quote. This is what you've been sort of getting at. Could you unpack that statement for us a bit more, Ari, and reflect on how Berlin's thicker liberalism, as you call it, illuminates or perhaps obscures some of our current intellectual debates?
Well, thank you for that. Yes, I mean, there's much to unpack there, but I think that the one way of getting it, one can approach it through Berlin's biography, and the second one is through Berlin's writing and essays. And I think that part of what is one of the key, biographical and contextual elements here has to do with, another element of the post-World War for a Jew, which is a post-Holocaust world, and a world after 1948 in which you have a sovereign Jewish national state. And so much of Berlin's thought tries to grapple with how can I distinguish between, if you'd like, a good nationalism and bad nationalism. Sometimes in English you can play with it if you work with the tension between nationality or nationalism. Many thinkers that didn't like the very thought experiment here, right? Ernest Gollner, I think, was mocking scholars of nationalism that think about nationalism as table wine. It's good if you drink a bit, but in excess it can harm you. And that was a bit of a mockery, I think, almost not directly aimed at people like Berlin. But I think that part of what Berlin is doing in the post-war world is moving away from cosmopolitanism. So I think that earlier, it's not a coincidence that the great majority of Jewish intellectuals, especially Central European German Jewish German intellectuals, were very much fascinated by cosmopolitan ideas. I mean, they're going back, of course, to Immanuel Kant. They're imagining exactly, especially we're thinking about people who are coming from the Habsburg world and looking at the dual monarchy Austro-Hungary as a model of an alternative coexistence of multiple nationalities until it breaks down in World War I. They tended to move, they were very much inclined towards cosmopolitanism. For Berlin, this is an experiment that failed and failed miserably, which is, I think, pushes him to understand the drive towards nationalism, and how to find a way to create this nationalism. I don't think he found an extremely a productive way. I think that part of what is happening here is that Berlin started his career as a British Jew that is inclined to support the Jewish nationalist project in an era, in an environment. This is the mandatory periods when the British are still ruling so many great parts of the Middle East, in which one could imagine different type of constellations in which you can enjoy a limited degree of autonomy and self-government under the umbrella of a bigger entity. And this is part of what breaks down in the immediate post-World War. The quick and drastic collapse of the British Empire that is dwarfed into the smaller, much more smaller and weaker Commonwealth is central to the context in which he's operating. But he still remains a persistent liberal, I would argue, because he disagrees deeply with an excessive nationalist interpretation that says, here's a national solution. The very language of if the 19th century, as a brilliant historian called it, was the age of questions, the Jewish question, the woman question, the Irish question, and so on. The 20th century, sadly, is the century of solutions. And there was something that he rejected radically. And in my book, for instance, I argue that a very interesting debate he had with Arthur Koestler, the very influential Cold War intellectual, that was tied these Cold War anxieties and the nationalist anxieties. Arthur Koestler, once a Jewish national state was established, said, haha, the question is, we solved the problem, and now any Jew in the world needs to choose. Either if you want to maintain your Jewish identity, turn yourself into a citizen of the Jewish Republic, move there, and in a way fulfill the dream of the anti-Semite of a Europe clean of Jews. But if you want to remain, assimilate. Stop being a Zaberlin, turn into a Jim, right? Just shed off all your earlier identity. And I suggest in the book that this was one, not the only, but a very important moment in which Berlin says, Mr. Koestler, what you're suggesting is almost totalitarian, right? You are asking the individual to make this, you're limiting the range of options open to an individual. I can be Jew in different ways, and this is why I think his conception is still liberal, because at the end of the day, what he wants to defend is an individual who's making a choice, whether to stay or to go, and he wants to have a broad range of choices. So in a way, the freedom that he protects so much is the air that we need to breathe in order to make choices. And the more doors open to us, the more path we can choose from, the freer we are. And there's something like a gut reaction that will have a philosophical answer to the very notion that, it's an either or black and white decision, which is connected to his specific national predicament and position, but can be definitely universalized in a broader sense.
So, Andrius, following along the same theme, critics of Rawls have tried to deflate what they consider to be the universalist pretensions of his liberal theory, arguing that it abstracts too far from concrete particulars, especially those pertaining to identity and social context. Rawls is also famously criticized for the uncosmopolitan nature of his work. He takes his principles of justice to apply only within the domestic context of territorial states, leading critics to decry the apparent contradiction between the universalism of Rawls' political theory on the one hand and the explicit boundedness of its application. So how would you characterize the way in which Rawlsian liberalism navigates these interrelated tensions, which Ari has just described as they've manifested in Berlin's own work, between universalism and contextualism or pluralism on the one hand, and between nationalism and cosmopolitanism on the other hand?
And Ari hit a good point on the original position and the way in which Rawls try to show to everyone that reasonable persons can come to an agreement. In later thoughts after the theory of justice, Rawls corrected that he exaggerated too much. He exaggerated the role of rational choice in his political theory, and that thought experiment misdescribed what the actual intent, what the moral intuitions were behind the thought experiment. That his goal was not to show that human beings are deracinated or that various aspects of their identity are not important to them, but that was a quick way of showing how, if we set aside those parts of identities that address our own interests and so can mislead us in that way, can be put aside, and we can show what principles of justice we would all choose if we were properly motivated in that sense. And he also remarked that half of his conference presentations were attempts to explain to others that they misinterpreted him often on these grounds of the rational choice. And so I think he regretted phrasing the argument in those particular ways. That said, sometimes misdescriptions like this are indicative of other things, right? And so there are various ways in which Rawls does stand outside of the various contexts that are so important for Berlin. And so maybe that's where I'll start. So you mentioned nationalism, for example, Ari, and in Rawls's work on international justice, for instance, he describes the kind of law he tries to elaborate as a law for people. So that's his attempt to distinguish it from nation states, that the states should be looked at as societies, as cooperative ventures described by the kind of political and social structures that govern them and the ideals that they have, rather than a nationalistic attachment to a particular plot of land, for example. But if you look at the examples that he gives in that book, so now going away from nationalism, but he gives an example of an imaginary society, which I think shows the difference between the ways of thinking of Berlin and Rawls. It's a imagined Muslim society that is not anywhere to be found in that exact detail. And the point of that example was to show those features of the argument that mattered, rather than address the particular circumstances on the ground. So there's definitely that distinction to be made. That said, when he wrote of these principles of justice as being universal principles and universally applicable principles, I think that's the right way of understanding what Rawls was trying to do. He ended the theory of justice with a description that what he was providing was a view from eternity. If we view human beings in a proper way, then we'll see those principles. But it didn't mean to him that every society would look alike, and so that's where this contextualism comes in. And I think it's important to emphasize this, that I'll use some technical terms, but hopefully the intuition comes through that once you decide on these broad principles, which as I was trying to argue, he viewed as just bins of reasons, not rules for reasoning later on as to apply to society, but those values to which citizens can appeal when formulating other aspects of more particular aspects of their society. So the next stage was the constitutional convention, in which the constitution should be arrived at. And one of Rawls's thoughts there is that it's unclear whether one should prefer a property-owning democracy or a more state-driven economy, which I think shows how wide of a range of there is for democratic choice. And then let alone when you move to the later stages about the kinds of laws and policies that the society should adopt. So I think his thinking was that you might start with the more broad principles and then try to apply them. But once you do so, that's exactly when you try to engage those particular reasons that matter to particular people on the ground. This is not to say that the critics of Rawls would take this as a very convincing answer, but I do want to say that context did matter for Rawls in his own way. And as I'm sure we'll discuss later on, it's definitely not an outright unreasonable idea that you start with a broad idea and then try to see what that idea might tell us about the particular situation in which one finds itself. And when it comes to the scope of the application of the principles that you mentioned, that's one of I guess, disappointments for those liberals who drew on Rawls's theory of justice in their own thinking for international world, that Rawls himself thought that the principles of justice would remain applicable to each particular society in international relations. It didn't mean that justice as a virtue is not applicable in the international world. There's still various duties that stem from human rights, for example. There's treaties, our obligations to help human beings in genocidal regimes and so on. But it's definitely right that those principles of justice that were intended to promote the life prospects of the least advantaged human beings, those were not to be applied on a broader scale. And so in that sense, he was not a cosmopolitan in that way. But there are not very many. I'll hold that point. But what I wanted to bring out is the reasons for which Rawls thought that we should limit justice to apply only to each particular society, and that is that for him the question always was, what affects the chances of each individual, as Ari described, the core of liberalism, chances of each individual in a particular society. And his answer was that it is the political culture and institutions of each society that have that most important impact. And that was his answer to the various critics that argued, we do have that basic structure. It's the world as a whole. We have various trade practices that are informal and formalized. We have all kinds of political institutions. We have cultural exchanges that do, and maybe more importantly, various restrictions, such as freedom of movement, that do hold some individuals in place and prohibit the kind of movement that Rawls imagined in terms of their life chances. But his response was that we have to look at what affects chances of each human being, and that is the political culture of each society. Still, I do want to say that, one of the contributions of Rawls is to provide that way of thinking in terms of basic structure, which other creative human beings, creative liberals, can then make use to their own arguments, and that I think should be acknowledged as at least at somewhat of a contribution on Rawls's own rights, even if he himself disagreed with the way the other thinkers employed his own thought.
I want to go to a maybe more general question. Liberalism, of course, has confronted heavy criticism in recent years. Andrius, you start your book on Rawls with the assertion that liberal political philosophy is in crisis. And needless to say, a diverse set of recent books and essays have been responding to the social and political crises around us by advancing resonant critiques of liberalism, and especially of Western liberal democracy. Each of you, of course, brings to this debate a deeply intimate perspective on one central figure of post-war liberalism. But you also bring a wider bird's eye view of the intellectual landscape in which the ideas of these figures crystallized and continue to exert their force. So given your perspective, which is at once thoroughly intimate and comprehensive, what do you see as contemporary liberalism's greatest limitations and pitfalls? And how do you think we can best overcome or move beyond these limits? Andrius, perhaps you could start.
I should maybe preface that I'm not very pessimistic about the future of liberalism. As I think emerged from both of our remarks, it's a very broad tradition. It draws on a variety of philosophical frameworks, on different political ideas. And so even some of the ideas that some of the problems that one might list can be true of some thinkers, some strands of liberalism, and not so for others. And even if it's true for some particular branch, they can draw on a variety of ideas to try to respond to them. So that said, of course, there are various problems, and in your previous seminars on this talk, you've addressed a variety of them. And what is particularly interesting to me is the question as to whether the historical embeddedness of liberalism with various kinds of inequalities, racism, sexism, and so on, whether they show any kind of conceptual entanglement as well, which would be deeply problematic for liberal political thought. And so I want to look at in this comment into one of these problems, and that is how we address other citizens in our deliberation with them, because I think it shows one of the virtues of Rawls's approach, and then also I think some, what I would say, conceptual limitations in that approach. And so that's why I want to focus on that one. And that's the concept of public reason, the requirement that once we as citizens deliberate about public issues that would result in laws or other kinds of practices that affect our life chances, we should do so in terms of reasons that are to be found in public political culture. There are various spheres of this reasoning. So Rawls takes as a paradigmatic example as the Supreme Court, but I think that's a easier case, if you can say so. I think it's more difficult to talk about the citizen to citizen deliberation, and so that's where I want to focus this comment on. And so what I think is to be remembered about Rawls's approach is that in trying to formulate our own views about what's valuable in human life, when talking to another person, we want to talk to another person, first of all, in a language that they can understand, and address the reasons that those human beings have. Maybe some of the reasons only, but still the reasons that those human beings have. And that's, I think, for Rawls as a way of respecting that person. When it comes to the application of laws themselves, then that creates another issue of legitimacy and the justification of the force of forcing a citizen to behave in a certain way. But in a citizen-to-citizen deliberation, it's a way of showing respect to that person. And I think that should be remembered, that there's the moral intuition behind this as a way of acknowledging the person as they are, which means not talking to them in a language which is alien to them. That said, the actual requirement is that your own thoughts that might stem from some what Rawls calls a comprehensive tradition, so tradition that talks about all kinds of values. So you could be a Kantian liberal, a Millian liberal, and a Marcusean socialist, and you have to make sure that language, the main terms that you use, is at least translatable at some point in the conversation into some language that the other person can understand. And the conceptual difficulty for me is that if you truly accept the meaning holism that I think Wittgenstein, Quine held, I'd attribute that to Berlin as well, then what you do in trying to translate that language in the broader terms, such as liberty, equality, or particular rights that stem from it, then you end up hiding the disagreement that's behind it. And I take it that's one of the points of Berlin that, at least to me, is a most important contribution, is that we don't want to obfuscate the pluralism that is in the actual debate, and the kind of we don't want to obfuscate the disagreement that is in that debate. And there are various reasons for which we don't want to do that. One is arguably you respect the person more by actually acknowledging the kind of argument they make, rather than the retranslated argument when it's phrased in terms of public reason. But it also matters, I think, for various political issues that we're facing today, such as how do we deal using public reason with various extreme views, for example. Public reason would exclude them from public deliberation, but they don't disappear as a result of that. And so we want to even just for reasons of safety, you can say, but for other reasons too, to engage in, and to try to understand the kinds of concepts from which they stem. And so that's why I think if you try to always retranslate the kind of reasons you have, you end up not really addressing the point of view of the other person, which can then lead to more important problems. I'm not giving it as an explanation of what's happening in our societies, but I think in principle that it can something like this can definitely happen. And so that's where I would draw much more on Berlin and trying to address these kinds of issues. I already try to say that there's much more of that way of thinking in Rawls than is generally acknowledged, but in this particular case, I think one can go even further and allow that pluralism to emerge in public discussions much more thoroughly, even if later on that requirement to retranslate it in terms of public reason still remains. You ask what I would suggest. I wouldn't venture to say this as a suggestion of sorts, but one of the ways in which other traditions have dealt with, such as deliberative Democrats or even agonistic Democrats, is to focus more on kind of conditions in which public deliberation takes place rather than a language that is being used in those tradition, as well as outlining a conception of respect that's compatible with another person talking to you in ways in a language that is not your language, and yet being able to understand their language as their language. There are various other issues that are related here. So I don't think either of us mentioned Rousseau as one of the influences of liberalism, but that's where Rousseau's conception of everyone obeys the laws, but in doing so, they only obey themselves. I think that's one of the influences on Rawls, and in this case, it's one that's perhaps the more, the one that leads in the directions that the liberalism, I think, should not go to. But that's why I wanted to preface the remarks by saying that other traditions of liberalism do not face that problem. I think it's a problem that's very interesting and intricate for Rawlsians and following the public reason, but other types of liberals would not take it as their problem at all.
There's certainly a lot there. Ari, how would you respond to the question?
First and foremost, I mean, it's extremely well said, Andrius. I think that I cannot agree more about the important role of communication and citizen deliberating. I mean, so in a way, I think that if there is a very positive Berlinian legacy of a post-war liberalism that maybe also distinguishes it from other forms of liberalism and also chronologically from earlier terms of kinds of liberalism, that it's really a liberalism that takes diversity into consideration. It's not about this unitary form, and this is where to paraphrase the Churchillian saying, two cheers for democracy, but not 20. Liberalism after today has many criticisms. Many of these criticisms are fair and important. This is where I will switch gears, and I will not represent here Berlin. I won't, but perhaps myself. So I don't want to be misunderstood as if I'm appropriating Berlin or doing what Berlin was always accused of doing, using past thinkers to express his own ideas through their mouth. So I think that there are many extremely important, valuable criticisms of liberalism today. Some of them are connected to ideas, to tensions one can find in Isaiah Berlin's thought. I alluded to the tension between individualism and a sense of a community or communitarianism. There are also a lot of criticisms that emerged in the post-communist world. So if we stop calling it post-war liberalism, but call it a Cold War liberalism. So a lot of questions that need to be asked are about what happened when the communist regime collapses, a new age opens. And much of the bad reputation that liberalism suffers from today has to do with ideas that neither Rawls or Berlin would have endorsed. They were not Fukuyama's thinking that with the collapse of the communist bloc, that's it. Liberal democracy triumphed. All the other alternatives are rendered irrelevant. So this is a valuable criticism of liberalism, but not of the specific two thinkers we are endorsing here. And one should also mention criticisms about excessive capitalism. So liberalism is always equated and and often in a very inaccurate way with either libertarian ideas or neoliberal economy, which I think one can very easily find in Berlin ideas that run counter to that, not only biographically because he started his career as a huge supporter of the New Deal. In his youth, he was what I called, a part of a group of Liblabs, and someone that probably voted Labor most of his life and not exactly Tory. But also the liberal interventions. So the language, and this should be put on the table as something that liberalism and after the Cold War started doing, that the war in Iraq. And this is a poignant and a touchy issue because people would use liberal arguments and would appropriate Berlinian ideas to support that. I don't think Berlin had a strong opinion about the so-called weapons of mass destruction that justify American invasion to Iraq. So I think that there are a lot of things that we need to put on the table when we're asking about the problems of liberalism today. But in a way, there's much that we can go back to in these thinkers and draw ideas from them to understand the shaky foundations. And this is where perhaps, again, me as a historian would say, looking back at history is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, of course, we need to read history and to draw lessons and to see how past figures dealt with similar dilemmas. But sometimes it backfires at us if we have excessive analogies that become a language of permanent crisis. Many times, our liberal institutions are a bit like our infrastructure, our roads and bridges. They simply need engineers that will maintain them. And too quickly we fall in the language of crisis and collapse. And the excessive use of analogies with the most extreme cases, the Weimar Republic and the collapse, I think deflate us from really doing this really important but boring work of maintaining, right? of keeping the foundations solid, and automatically open up this kind of idea of a catastrophe that is looming beyond the corner. And this is where, again, here I think Berlin would agree with me. It opens up a very, the door to a very shady place in which intellectuals want to rule, become these experts that rule the masses, right? Because we are the expert that know better, we need to be in charge. And this is something that the Berlinian sentiment, I think, would automatically, look with an ironic eye at these intellectuals that are coming with wonderful ideas, but in their own way are also power hungry. And exactly because we need to defend liberalism, we need to hear their voices, but also remember how to check their ideas when needed. So I provided here a very incoherent hybrid mix of Berlinian ideas and my own interpretations. But I think that there's I agree with you, Andreas, that to paraphrase Mark Twain, the rumors about my death are premature. Liberalism is still here. As someone that knows societies and regimes that are not liberal, there's always a question of if the alternative is so much better. So maybe as someone that grew up in a society which was not exceptionally strong on its liberal conditions, I perhaps have a better sense of what is the alternative, and the alternative I'm not sure is that good. So that will be probably my intervention in that field.
Andrius, did you want to briefly respond to that?
If I can add something to this, so you raise the question about the role of public intellectuals, which is such an important question in the context of this discussion that we're having. And famously, Michael Walzer would describe a theory such as Rawls as ending the democratic debate. And it's interesting to me how the various liberals respond to this conceptualization. So, for example, defending or rather offering his work on international justice, Matthias Risse describes it as a contribution to democratic deliberation. Here's a theory that I think stems from this particular framework, which draws in some ways on Rawls, but it's one of the contributions so that the other citizens can join in and discuss what liberalism should be. And that's where this question of democratic deliberation, I think, becomes more and more central, I think, to the, at least among the Rawlsian thinkers, or rather those who draw in some ways on Rawls.
Well, this has been an immensely stimulating, interesting exchange. Before we close, I just wanted to have one final brief question. Perhaps you can each share with us a little bit about where your intellectual energies are heading over the next months and years. What are some of the questions you're hoping to answer? What are some of the research projects you're hoping to pursue? Ari, perhaps we could start with you.
Yeah, I mean, it might seem completely disconnected to my earlier interest in Berlin and his ideas, but I find myself in recent years studying more and more the interwar years and the role of the British Empire in the Middle East. It's connected contextually to Berlin. It was actually a very interesting window through which one could see the tensions. At the level of political theory, it opens up very interesting thoughts about something I alluded to briefly in passing earlier, attempts to find sort of ways of containing national sentiments within a broader umbrella in a way, and also autonomous ideas and federalist ideas that were circulating at the time. So intellectually and philosophically, it's a fascinating universe. Historically, it's dubious because it was again done under the umbrella of a British Empire. And I think that part of what I'm trying to explore in recent years is kind of this paradox that is built into the British liberal project at the age of empire. On the one hand, a project that is committed to emancipation and liberty and creating parliaments and institutions that are valuable, but doing it in the context of expansion and colonialism, and how can you untie these? So I'm joining a group of historians that are looking at a critical eye at liberal imperialism and trying to see how to understand this complex universe historically.
Thanks very much. Andrius?
I am currently interested in the question of animal rights and the extent to which the liberal political theory can be used to address the various issues, especially how cities should be organized in response to them. But it relates to our discussion and through the concept of the basic structure. So I have in mind a wonderful, thought-provoking work by Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka, Zoopolis, which tries to use the liberal concepts to explain that animals, to argue that animals should be included into our cooperative scheme, should be treated as equal members of our cooperative scheme and treated as co-citizens of it. So it draws on the same broad idea that in some sense animals are part of a structure which creates various benefits and harms, and therefore a question of political philosophy is to address how these benefits and harms should be shared, not just on a human level, but also on a non-human level. I think it's interesting. It's an interesting question in so many ways, not just on an animal level, which that on its own would be extremely interesting, but also on what it says about the questions of the kind of the way in which we understand the liberal society, which is one of the questions as I saw posted in the chat, how we should view our society. And so one of the ways in which we can say so is that we view ourselves intentionally as members of that society, as seeing ourselves as contributing agents. But if we did accept this demanding explanation, then very few human beings would fit under that description. But if we loosen it to say, well, we're just contributing members, then that opens the door for opening non-humans as well. Of course, Donaldson and Kimlicka still need to argue many things, that animals fit the description of agents and so on, but those are separate questions.
Ari Dubnov, Andrius Galisanka, as Ben just said, it's been such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for hosting us.
Thank you. Thanks also to our sponsors, the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, and the Center on Modernity and Transition. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us today. We hope you'll do it again in 2 weeks on Friday, April 2nd at 12:15 Eastern, when Ben and I will have the great pleasure of welcoming Luke Brotherton and Charles Matthews to discuss the future of political theology. See you then.